Well, I'm very nervous today because the person I'm interviewing, I didn't really prepare for because I've kind of been preparing for it for, 28 years or so. But I'm delighted to talk to Michael Hoffman, who has played many roles. He's been an acting CEO. He's been a general counsel for very large companies. He's now a COO, a president role with a title company. And he, more importantly, has been a very dear friend for many years. He's been a client, and I know too much about him. So I'm very, very nervous to make sure that I keep this interesting, but I know it will be because you'll make it interesting. But Michael, welcome. Thank you for doing this.
Oh, it's my pleasure, Craig. I'm excited to be here and to participate, and this is a lot of fun, and I certainly appreciate the opportunity to share some thoughts.
So you and I talked about doing this interview before March of 2020, but then the world changed. I mean, it changed for all of us, but particularly it changed for you and your family. You were a victim of COVID. You went on a trip with, as I recall, your sons to Europe. We talked about it because I had just gotten back from being in Europe, and COVID hit like crazy where I was in Milan. And so there's so many things I want to talk about, but I actually want to start on that, if you don't mind, which is talk a little bit what happened to you. I know some of it I know better than you in a sense,
right.
But talk a little bit about that story. And, it's so timely right now as we're dealing with another huge spike in COVID. But I think the people listening will want to hear this story.
Sure. Well, as you said, frankly, with a little bit of trepidation and certainly some kind of back and forth debating internally and frankly with some close friends, obviously including you, I did struggle a bit at the time when deciding to make what ended up being a spring break trip for my middle son, Aaron, from college to take him to Manchester in the UK to witness and participate in the Man City-Man United game. He's a huge soccer fan, and frankly, I thought it would be, the event or experience of a lifetime for someone like him devoted to the sport to see it in that kind of a forum. And part of my thinking or reasoning was I also wanted to visit my oldest son who was studying in Spain. And as you noted, that at the time, COVID definitely, or the coronavirus itself, was getting some press, and we definitely thought we took adequate steps to kind of prepare or be careful. We had, the hand sanitizers and masks and other things with us, but certainly both for ourselves and in terms of what we experienced, the world had not yet adopted, frankly, the safety precautions and the distancing and the other things that go with it to try to prevent spread. And as a matter of fact, I'd say to you that particularly in the UK, that second week of March, it felt almost normal from visiting tourists and activity and restaurants and the scene itself. The event that we really primarily went over for was tremendous, but I believe it was one of the last major sporting events held before they stopped allowing, obviously, fans to come because, it was approximately 80,000 people, screaming people in a stadium, having a phenomenal time, but certainly, physically very close to each other and not probably the best event for avoidance of the virus and its spread. The bottom line is we traveled from there to London and then ultimately to Madrid. And when I did arrive in Madrid, it felt like there that the country and certainly the city itself was undergoing lockdown as we arrived. You could feel it was a very different stress level. The night we got there, all museums in the country were closed because of the spread of the virus. And we made plans to come back as early as that Friday, 36 hours later. on a flight to Dallas. And it ended up being somewhat fortuitous that we made those revised plans because President Trump issued an order that evening essentially banning European flights to the United States after midnight on Friday. So it was a rather stressful return home. That Friday that we flew, I didn't feel my best. I had been incredibly active. I don't think I really gave it much thought and certainly didn't connect the dots to anything else. But I didn't feel great. And my wife, who wanted to be cautious anyway, who did not travel with us, picked us up and immediately kind of quarantined me and my two sons. But by the very next day, that Saturday, I started having some respiratory challenges and a little bit of fever and other things that certainly were not typical and normal for me. And by Sunday, I felt serious about it enough that I actually went to the ER here at a local hospital, at a Presbyterian hospital, because I wanted to be tested. I wanted to know. They did test me. The test ended up showing that I was negative. They sent me home. That negative result, though, of course, was 48 hours later. And by the time that negative test result was ready for viewing, I had already returned once again to the ER at Presbyterian Hospital, and this was March 17th. And that day, not only did they retest me, but they admitted me, moved me into an ICU, and ultimately had me on oxygen. And then the next day, intubated me and put me on a ventilator.
So for the listener, yeah, I mean, so Michael and I live, 2 blocks away from each other, but I've been in Park City, as you know. I mean, we were communicating while you were in Europe. We were talking about your logistics. So I was kind of living this with you. But at some level, you developed some shortness of breath and some symptoms that were very disturbing. For those of us who are constantly paranoid, do I have COVID? What were the things you were experiencing?
Well, actually, I think that's an interesting point from the standpoint that I don't believe that the symptoms that I was exhibiting at the time seemed like they were the typical symptoms for COVID. Primary, of course, was, and that was the respiratory distress. I felt, and particularly difficult when I was horizontal, if I was laying down, that it was a challenge to really pass air, to breathe in and out. Didn't have much of an appetite, definitely had fever, although the fever was not an off-the-charts fever at the time, but it was certainly elevated nonetheless. And I did have some headache and things like that, but it didn't feel as flu-ish. I didn't really have the full body ache. And I actually had some digestive distress as well, which the doctors actually said, well, that's a good thing. That probably means you don't have COVID. I don't think it always looks the same, but certainly the primary factor was that respiratory distress, which was certainly real. And even once admitted in the hospital, having oxygen on at the time did alleviate some of that, but clearly my lungs were essentially filling with fluid. There was a lot of pneumonia. Ultimately, it became a very serious issue for me in the hospital.
And so I remember this very well. And I don't think, I know you were feeling it. I don't think really those of us around you really appreciated the seriousness or where this could head. But then the doctor pretty early prescribed a ventilator for you, right? And actually you and I talked, you made some phone calls. Talk a little bit about that. And
it was a very strange thing, to your point, because I certainly didn't, I knew or believed that I assumed that I did have COVID. It was not, like I said, my symptoms or feeling, it wasn't typical of anything I had ever experienced before. And the respiratory distress was significant enough that I knew that something was up, and this was the natural thing to assume at the time. I certainly didn't think then or ever that I was going to be in a position where, frankly, I was near death or was fighting to survive. The pulmonologist who ended up being the head of critical care at the hospital did talk to me early on, as you said, and literally asked me for permission to put me on the ventilator. after explaining that he certainly thought it was a necessary step to try to help oxygenate my lungs. And it was clear enough to me that there was no debate about it. It was really just going to be a question of when and how soon he wanted to do it. And, frankly, I think it goes to something I've always believed in, which is deference to professionals. I even though I had just relatively recently met him, I did have high confidence and knew that I needed help and that his judgment was going to be better than mine on what that next appropriate step was.
We're talking about Dr. Weinstein. He wasn't just a pulmonologist, right? He was the pulmonologist who dealt with Ebola, if I recall correctly, which hit Dallas first after it left Africa. The patient zero in the United States was in Dallas. Is that correct?
That's right. No, you're exactly right. He's head of critical care for Texas Health Dallas, obviously there at Presbyterian Hospital. And he had a lot of experience with that. He essentially, as you said, was kind of the centerpiece of the medical team dealing with Ebola when it happened. That ended up being incredibly helpful to me for several reasons. One, a willingness on his part to consult and to be innovative and somewhat creative and experimental because they needed to be given the newness of COVID-19. And then secondly, there were some treatments and protocols that he was actually able to replicate and make use of during my treatment from his experience in dealing with Ebola.
Just to frame it, I mean, we're talking about March 13th. Is that when you went on a ventilator? March 11th?
No, the 13th was the day I flew home. The 17th I was admitted, and the 18th, which was a Wednesday, was when they actually put me on the vent. And I stayed on that ventilator for the next 31 days. Basically, shortly after putting me on the ventilator, the next thing he did or arranged for was to put me in a bed they call a rotoprone bed. It's a sophisticated contraption where you're basically in a prone position, meaning lying face down or on your belly, strapped in, and the bed is hoisted in the air and essentially has the ability to rock at 45-degree angles while the ventilator is underneath you attempting to oxygenate your lungs.
They put you in a coma because, you were almost like in a coffin with glass, right?
He later told me that the joke is not joke, I guess, but the expression or off-color reference that they make is they do call it sometimes a rotocoffin, and frankly, that has more to do with the very, very low survival rates for patients that are using that equipment to help deal with what obviously is a pretty severe respiratory situation, like I was doing. It was getting progressively much worse. Even the X-rays from that time period were basically a solid white. It was all fluid. There was really no room. And I was essentially 100% dependent on outside air from the ventilator to have oxygen in my body. The other thing that's just fascinating, obviously, is that ventilator. It's a powerful machine. Obviously, it can save your life, but it also creates lots of other issues. And frankly, I think the theme of the treatment at a lot of levels was, you do what you do to try to help the patient survive. You don't worry as much about some of the side effects or even consequences because you're taking fairly dramatic action to try to keep your patient alive. And everything from, sepsis to staph infections to multiple organ failures and complications, all that, really was triggered for me, even though, frankly, before this, I had never had any of those underlying conditions. My really sole, other than carrying more weight than I should, my sole kind of ailment or issue was high blood pressure, which frankly had been treated for years with a low dose medicine. So all this AFib, diabetes, the infections, the number of different issues were all kind of in a domino effect triggered from my illness.
And just so everyone appreciates the severity, you were out for over a month.
Yep.
And the doctor at one point had your wife, Jackie, who's, of course, one of my partners, but way before that, you guys are extremely close to our family and me, working on a do not resuscitate, like what should we do? Because it would take so long to resuscitate you because you had to remove this roto coffin, quotes, and that ended up probably saving your life. And so the question was, how do we fulfill your wishes? But that's how serious it got. And the vent levels, right? The amount of pressure and oxygen that was coming out of that ventilator into your lungs was about at the max they could do. There was nowhere else to go at a certain point.
Absolutely. And in my vitals, particularly when they tried, and each day they did attempt to turn me, and at the turn, often my vitals would plummet. And as we talked about, there were other things that it had triggered. There was at the time even high fever that absolutely approached 105, etc. I was getting, ice baths, etc. To your earlier point, my awareness level was a 0. I was in that they used a paralytic. They didn't want me to move or potentially pull out any of the tubes or wires or anything that was connected to medical equipment, of course, and needed me absolutely still. So that was the way that they accomplished it. I understand that some of those drugs that they use are also pretty good at blocking memory. So I really do have almost 0 recall from the time that I was intubated until I awoke in the ICU. And frankly, even when I awoke, I had no sense of the number of medical issues or challenges or some of those other ancillary things that happened for quite some time afterwards. I just knew when I awoke that I was completely without the ability to do much more than blink at the time.
And it, I could probably use some of those drugs because I have very vivid memories of waking up in the middle of the night and, having been buried alive in my dream and different things, which I assume had some, was a sympathetic reaction to what you were going through, but all ended well, right? I mean, here we are. You're back at your home. You're back at work. But, and so many people talk about the healthcare workers, but you really you left the hospital to great fanfare because you were an incredible success. You were one of the first patients to be on remdesivir, to get plasma. We don't know which cocktail saved your life, but something did. But we do know that these healthcare workers, who I had the pleasure to deal with a little bit, but that they were your lifeline. Talk a little bit when people say thank you, it's a little bit like thank you for your service to the military. Talk about what these people are going through to save patients' lives like yours and to put their own at risk.
I mean, it's fairly unbelievable, my appreciation level for that industry, that space, and those type of people is off the charts. I mean, it's as we approach Thanksgiving, the gratitude that I have for the medical community is truly unbelievable because, frankly, they did things. First of all, it's that beyond service. It's what we all want. Our staff, our teams, our outside counsel, it's the above and beyond. There were ICU nurses that, in addition to doing everything medically they needed to, were looking on my phone for favorite music to play in the room or showing, me on FaceTime to my family so they could say goodnight and attempt to say words that might make it into my head or my heart. So who knows what level of encouragement and inspiration contributed or gave me the will to keep fighting the good fight to survive. But, it's all of those types of things that happened on a regular basis and frankly, at great risk themselves. The protective equipment is wonderful and hopefully is well tested, etc. There was so much, especially at that time, unknown about what was clearly a very deadly virus that obviously is still raging and causing massive destruction in the world. But those folks were in the same room with me. They were coming in to check, and take care of me at tremendous exposure to themselves. They all have obviously different levels of willingness about how close and what that all meant. But it was an unbelievable experience. By the way, the other piece of it, even beyond the medical, was one of the biggest challenges I faced, certainly once, waking up, was isolation. And the medical staff were the only humans that I came in contact with for a 74-day period while at that institution. And, while oftentimes it was no more than their the box around their eyes that I could see, because everything else was masked and covered and gloved and draped over. But nonetheless, that was my human interaction. And for someone that kind of has always enjoyed being social and extroverted, it was that was one of the most challenging pieces of the experience, for sure. To cap your point before, I will say, and I mean this sincerely, that I and it was bigger than the 74 days in the hospital, because as you know, I spent 4 months of outpatient rehab afterwards until the beginning of October. And through that entire time, in an outpatient at 3 different medical institutions in this great city, I had not experienced a single therapist, nurse, or doctor that wasn't outstanding in terms of their level of care, concern, compassion, and encouragement, which I needed to help me both immediately deal with the illness and recovery and give me hope for a return to some normalcy in the future.
I know you and I've talked about this a lot, about your gratitude for different elements. And I'd be remiss if I didn't mention Jackie, your wife, who I dealt with, sometimes 5 times a day during that 70 plus day period. Kind of nice to have a wife who also happens to be a healthcare lawyer. The bulk of her career working for hospitals and working with these healthcare workers on legal issues, and her ability to kind of keep cool and understand how to help manage your care when you had no ability to do it yourself is pretty to watch.
It is amazing. I mean, literally, I have an eternal gratefulness that goes well beyond kind of the spousal obligations, or even just the sense of great person, great friend, great partner, and all of those things that she was beforehand. But this took that equation to a whole different level. As you said, it was the strategic, it was the coordination, it was the communication. And frankly, there was so much even that the doctors didn't know or needed to rely on and use her voice as mine, since I was unable to participate in terms of what we were willing to do or try, especially if it was more experimental. And she pushed them. She pushed them to think about things that she read about in journals and publications or newspapers from other cities or other parts of the world. And not to say that they won't have even thought of some of those things or all of those things themselves, but, part of it was basically she was holding them accountable and was a pressure. But I think it's also the old joke about it's hard to perform surgery on your own kid. She might be a incredibly skilled and experienced healthcare attorney, but it's a little more difficult when it's inside your own personal world. So, what she lacked, and that I again am very grateful for, is that she didn't have the time for herself to really emotionally process because of how fast and furious things were moving, and what she had to stay focused on more strategically. So, and that continued. It didn't end again the day I was discharged. She was critical in my rehabilitation process, in making sure I had the support and safety net to do what I could to recover at home. She missed many a night's sleep watching me attempt to breathe or seeing distress even after I was released from the hospital, and ultimately helped me deal with that and get a home ventilator and some supplemental oxygen. So it's been a very comprehensive commitment and again, other than saying I'm eternally grateful, that kind of encapsulates how I feel.
And it continues, right? I mean, we're over 8 months after ventilator, and you still get assistance with your breathing. I mean, I guess the exit question on this topic, because I do want to get into a lot of other issues with you, is, people are confronting right now. We're taping this on November 19th. And people are confronting maybe the biggest spike of COVID cases right now. We have better ways to deal with it. And I think, we have a divide in our country in so many ways, but I think some people feel like, well, it's okay to go back for Thanksgiving. I mean, I hear what people are saying, but come on, really, this is serious stuff. I mean, this still impacts your life daily. What are your thoughts to somebody who's kind of thinking about Thanksgiving or dealing with getting back together and potentially, exposing people to the virus? Talk a little about how does that make you feel right now when you hear that discussion?
I'd say somewhat mixed, because, and I know that's not probably what the answer that you'd expect me necessarily to say, given what I've been through. And I remember being told, by the way, that the hard work was just beginning when I awoke in the ICU. They said, you've medically survived, but what you're going to really have to do to rebuild yourself, especially if your goal is to return to a more normal lifestyle, that work is just beginning. And that was an absolutely accurate comment. With respect to your point on Thanksgiving and kind of advice or comments or thoughts to people, one is I'd remind them, this obviously is no hoax, and it's certainly not like the flu. Maybe it will be in the future with some good vaccines that are utilized on a widespread basis. I certainly hope so, because I do recognize that from a mental health standpoint, isolation has a cost on all of us. And whether it's, older relatives that you can't visit, or folks that are a little bit more susceptible or vulnerable that need to be protected, I think the bottom line is there's still so much that's unknown about this virus and who gets it in a more serious capacity like I did, and for what reason. But the bottom line is that no one is going to be smart enough to decipher and determine up front whether you're the one that's going to get the mild flu-like version or the version that I had. And I think that it's just wise, when you do a cost-benefit analysis, to take at least some reasonable steps, whether it's masking and distancing, whether it's the, kind of regular hand washing or other advice that everyone is saying that clearly helps or makes a difference and might mitigate the ability of you to either get the virus or, frankly, to even maybe unknowingly spread it to someone else. And I know that it's hard for people to stay the course and be compliant after what has felt like a very long time period. But I would tell them to keep perspective, and that if this is the one Thanksgiving that you need to miss, or the one Christmas break that you're not, traveling somewhere with your kids for, to endure that discomfort or pain to get to the other side more safely, because, again, while not wanting to be an overreactor, this, as you've heard from my comments, and this obviously, Craig, this, can be an incredibly devastating virus and illness with incredibly powerful consequences on your person. And we don't even know yet what the long-term effects of the virus will be on the body, which is a whole different aspect. But again, I can't see how any advice that, particularly if you're going to be in or around anybody that's in a more vulnerable class, whether that's by age or by other disabilities, to me, it's the right thing to do, not just for yourself, but to help kind of protect the community at large.
Yeah, well said. Well said. It's serious business. It is. At the age, you're almost 55, catching up to me. Every year you catch up to me. But, you're 54 when you experience this. So it's not just a virus that's impacting the elderly. It impacts many of us. And you didn't drink, you didn't smoke, you didn't have an unhealthy lifestyle. So it is quite scary. Well, let me transition a little bit, and I'll do a little bit of the background on this. You and I met in the early 90s through a mutual friend, and you were a very young general counsel of a company called Vartech Telecom. And, it's interesting as we talk about COVID, because I think for a lot of people, that might have been a change in who they are as a person, but you've always kind of had this, my kids who are very close with you comment on this, you've always had a level of equanimity and kindness and never an air of superiority. But, you had a very big job for a growing company in the telecom industry back when, we used something other than a mobile phone. Talk a little bit about, your leadership style was so profound and so impacted me. Talk a little bit about that. There's no hierarchy in your world in that sense. And where do you get that? Where do you draw that value system from in your leadership principles?
I think it's a few different places. I'd have to first cite my parents and my upbringing as certainly part of it. I was raised in a very middle-class family in the city of Philadelphia, and don't hold that against me. I won't make any Eagles comments, but I think that in truth, I loved a lot of the principles and still do, of course, and a lot of the ideals about this country, including the ability of those that work hard to be able to move between classes and, as long as there was opportunity to seek and do great things. But again, you can't live in a major metropolitan center where you're interacting with lots of people from all different walks of life on a regular basis. And it did help create some egalitarian thinking. And when I saw people demonstrate otherwise, even for instance, at my former law firm where I got my start, there was quite a distinction. I remember even at an annual holiday party, that separation between the attorneys and the staff, things like that bothered me immensely. Not to say that I didn't understand that people do different things and have different value and earn different amounts, of course. And I support that as well. But that doesn't mean you have to treat someone as a lesser simply because they're doing something that doesn't pay the same or have the same title or rank. That's really become, it's a core belief of mine in terms of how I like to treat others. And I think it was palpable and understood as I built a team. I've always liked, even at the top, what I call working partners, people that roll up the sleeves and want to be productive and not just orchestrate or conduct from the side, but are willing to get their hands dirty too and be part of it. That's something that I always kind of was striving for. So, yes, I was young and probably a bit too inexperienced, but frankly, I was what the company could afford, and there was kind of a mutual gamble, me with the business and hopefully that it would continue to grow and prosper, and their expectations, which were tough. I basically had two hats, one as corporate counsel for the business and the other as their head of regulatory affairs as they opened up other states and ultimately international markets around the world from a compliance and licensing standpoint. And that was my world too.
And the business of Vartech, of course, was that they basically rented the use of phone lines from the major phone companies and resold that on a per minute cost basis. I remember Vartech being famous for the dime line, right. 10 cents a minute. And so talk a little bit. It had a very different culture to it because it was a renegade, not just the company, but Joe Mitchell and the style, the culture of that company at that time. Talk a little bit about that, and we'll get into. I'll follow up with some questions about how you deal with outside counsel.
Sure. No, as you said, the company was as different as any people I had ever been around. If you will, my sphere of influence or familiarity, growing up in Philly and spending summers in New York at camp and college and things like that. My my world was basically between DC and Boston. So I was out of sorts when I moved to Dallas in 1992. It was a very different place, and it seemed like, nothing was recognizable. Where people even vacationed was different, whether it was New Mexico or Colorado or Oklahoma or Louisiana. It was, neighboring states here. So it was just a very foreign place. And the leadership at Vartech was reflective of that. They were largely from either Texas or Oklahoma, had some more rural roots, conservative. The company was largely executives that were part of Church of Christ as their church. I don't think any of them had ever met a Jew before. So it was fascinating at a lot of levels, including culturally, which is important for fit, of course, and feel, because obviously as a sitting general counsel, it's more than just the legal services, right? You need to, if you're going to have impact, be trusted, be communicated with, be part and become part of that most inner circle, so that you can have the kind of impact on the organization and make sure that your vote counts when there's that vote around the table. And I think, certainly it's not a day one situation, but I definitely believe I worked very hard, even on the cultural side. I mean, there were many Thursday evenings where I, bought boots and went boot scooting to Crystal Chandelier just to make sure they understood that, again, that elitism or that removed from their world wasn't acceptable to me. I wanted them comfortable, and that actually happened. I made many great friends in different aspects of the business, especially amongst that executive team, and frankly had a series of promotions within the business very quickly because I felt like it was understood and recognized and appreciated.
There's so many people who, especially early in their careers, forget the profession, but especially in the legal profession, who kind of have this imposter fraud syndrome where they don't think they're ready to deal with things that people are expecting them to deal with. And I know, too many stories to recount about how you were asked to deal with really difficult issues at a time when you were not the expert on that topic. And you don't come with a hubris and a big ego that you just assume, you'll figure it all out, although you've got a confidence about you. If you were sitting there as a younger professional embarking on their career, or whatever phase that somebody might be listening to this, what allowed you to find the fortitude to have a voice in a boardroom to help a company that was growing into a $1 billion plus multi-billion dollar enterprise, as its general counsel, is basically a 2, 3, 4, 5 year lawyer. How did you find that voice in that room in an authentic way?
I think that one of the ways that I found that voice was by listening before I talked, really learning the landscape, teaming with other trusted professionals, some of whom the company already had some familiarity with, to help bring even more legitimacy to my position if I had one. I didn't speak and still don't often speak in absolutes. I tried to educate enough, but to also find a way to get to yes, even if it came with certain conditions or restrictions. Obviously, at some point, there are lines that can't be crossed. But I would say to you, in my 16 years with the business, there were really only a handful of times where we approached a line that I knew could not be crossed, and I made it clear, frankly, with an internal understanding that if they did cross that line, I might have to leave or do something different. But in each of those instances, ultimately, the business and its leadership did the right thing. Again, not always without debate and a lot of stress and back and forth, but I did view it as a teaching moment or an opportunity, and I knew it had to start with earning their trust and allowing for them to believe that either I had those skills and tools or I knew where to find them. And that is something even very early on, whether it was relying on, obviously awesome outside counsel like you and your team. And I'm not just saying this because we're being interviewed. I've said this 1,000 times, that I always looked for outside counsel that felt like a natural extension of my internal team and that understood enough about not just the law, but what my business actually did and the dynamics at the business, that they could make impactful suggestions that were appropriate for the type of entity and its dynamics, because they're all different. And the bottom line is mine was a closely held private company with a certain type of leader that, needed at times to have a toe in the water as opposed to, jumping in with a cannonball right off the diving board. And to do otherwise, not only would have probably been a death sentence for me in that capacity, but also would have been an unacceptable either risk or shock or discomfort for the business itself. So I think some of it was just really assessing the landscape and lining up the resources that I could, obviously always keeping the economics in mind, right? We didn't have the ability to invest or spend, even if it were prudent, in, for instance, outside counsel or other consultants in an unlimited capacity as at the time, a $40, $50 million business. Obviously, over time, we became far more substantial and at a different kind of means. But it was always to me, an important thing to assess and then reassess maybe every 6 months the business, its resources, its needs, wants, and wishes, and to make sure that I brought in myself, in my team, in my outside teams, the kind of talent and resource needed to address the business at that particular moment.
Yeah, it's so interesting that the way you found standing, and you hear this over and over. I mean, I've done a number of these, and this theme keeps coming through that really great leaders lead by listening. They lead by conveying a sense to the person who's entrusting them to make decisions, a sense that they've heard them, they understand them, their business, their needs, the nuanced strategy. It's such a profound point, whether you're a leader in an organization or whether you're somebody servicing another organization, really making sure you do your homework and making sure that you continue to take inputs that instruct your outputs and how you act.
With high growth companies, particularly, you have to, because you'll essentially be obsolete if you continue to work and do the same as the business itself is morphing. It's certainly not limited to our legal space. I think it's kind of throughout, but it certainly applies in our legal space as well, where, there is that tremendous need to keep learning and growing and even anticipating what, of course, is coming down the pike so that you can be prepared to deal with whatever challenges or opportunities that business is going to be facing.
You touched on this about outside counsel, but, I think there are going to be a fair amount of listeners, whether within K&L Gates or outside, who kind of are trying to understand how to be a business developer, how to get the confidence of a general counsel. And as I said, Vartech became a huge company and had some really existential issues that you entrusted young outside counsel. When you and I really first dove into working together, I was very young counsel. Talk a little bit about what are some of the things you looked for that gave you a sense you could trust somebody with the existential threats to your business. And, if you were sitting there as a young lawyer thinking about, how do I develop somebody's trust like yours? What would you advise them?
Well, one thing I would certainly advise them is to understand that building any relationship takes time, and that to start early, and that you don't always see the payback from that investment day one. But that if you think about the fundamentals of trust, what I always liked is to take time and invest and spend that time and learn people and different firms and expertise so that I knew where to go when the crisis actually hit. Because for me, the wrong time to be shopping for counsel or for even within a firm trying to designate a particular attorney or group was when I was in crisis and my hair was on fire. I wanted to, over time, tested, sometimes at over a lunch table, sometimes, at another event or at a firm function or even watching them present, a CLE that's on point. That whole time I'm essentially assessing, and in my head, I'm building my team, whether they knew it or not, et cetera. But I kept a very clear and important contact group of who would I want in the trenches with me that's going to perform the way I would want them to, and I would perform myself if I either had the time, that skill set, etc. As like I said, as a natural extension of my legal department, and that I knew had the company's best interest at heart, as demonstrated by their ethics, their style, their areas of competence, as well as drive. I knew that it was an important impression, that especially as a young general counsel, right, I was, those extensions of legal sources and competence would be an important, even credibility check on me. So I needed that kind of teaming to help the organization and to promote a competence of the legal department itself in a place where most other departments were really evaluated based on a P&L situation as opposed to what we did to protect assets.
It's such a profound concept that you would evaluate people when they didn't necessarily think they were being evaluated. Act like somebody's watching even when they're not is such an important principle. We all get so balled up about a presentation or a pitch, and certainly you had many beauty contests for important matters, but you're building a story of your career with every interaction you have. It's a wonderful concept because it keeps people from putting on airs when they think they can get away with it.
The other thing that there's certainly no substitute for is, hopefully having the wisdom and judgment to evaluate others in terms of what their composition is like, whether it's, drive, intelligence, certainly their moral compass, all those types of things. And I like it from a teaching moment standpoint, whether it was my internal team or even if it was, outside counsel that allowed me to bring them in and spend the time to educate them about the business and our needs, etc. That was really important to me, but it's also really important to develop that as part of the profession where, I believe in apprenticeship. I don't think that even at the best law schools in the country that they know how to ready law students to be practicing attorneys. I think some of that, is something you absolutely have to shadow and experience from others. So again, whether they were internal or external, both from an opportunistic standpoint in terms of wanting to give that type of opportunity to those folks and to grow. I mean, there's no way to me that whether it was my internal team or my external outside counsel, they all want to be challenged and grow and feel like life is evolving and progressing. And I wanted them to have those opportunities. And nothing makes me happier or prouder than knowing that of the dozens of lawyers that worked with and for me inside that company, many of them, if not most, are now in general counsel positions themselves, and often still, literally as recent as this past month, send me letters or notes or messages talking about how what they learned with me is still impacting what they do day to day now at other institutions. So, and it goes to just how expansive that reach can be when you can positively impact others even when they're no longer with you.
Yeah, it is what I've always witnessed in you, that you're always trying to leave a conversation, leave the other person, thinking a little differently or with a different perspective than they started the conversation, which is powerful. And it's why there are so many people who I think consider you a mentor and friend. And certainly I would say that. I know we're approaching the hour, and we might have to at some point do a part 2 because there are just a lot of questions I'm going to leave on the cutting room floor. But you aren't the kind of person who walks around without perspective. But we started this conversation with your experience with COVID, and I'll probably end it with, is there something, there aren't too many of us that have the opportunity, and it's horrible, but it was an opportunity to face death, whether you knew you were facing death or not. You certainly know you did. And then come back from that. For somebody who was an evolved, thoughtful person before, I don't see major life change from you because of that experience. But what are your takeaways from that experience that you had?
I think you're right. I don't think that I don't view this as kind of either second chance or, the other side, or, I don't have any great stories about reaching out and seeing God and being sent back. I don't have any of that, at least in my story, and I'm certainly not making fun of it. I did have the delirium side, certainly, while I was under, and some wild thoughts and dreams, some of which were grounded in reality and others were not. But I think the takeaways for me, were a reinforcement of things I already believed, most fundamentally sanctity of life. Being that close, as you said, and being that sick, definitely made me think hard about the impact that I want to have, whether it's on child rearing or family relationships, or who I surround myself with from my friends, or frankly, even who I surround myself with from a work standpoint, and making sure that those choices are thoughtful and deliberate as opposed to just letting life happen to you. So that's certainly one theme. A second, obviously, is just gratitude in all of its different forms. Gratitude, as we talked about, for Jackie, gratitude for the medical team, from my coworkers, for obviously incredible friends like you that did so much, whether it was for my family or for me, and provided what they probably don't even understand or even really fully comprehend in terms of the inspiration and encouragement piece, which, can be overwhelming because you can feel so far away from that return to normalcy when you're in an incapacitated situation. So there is gratitude at so many levels, including just, for surviving and being part of the living world here. And then patience. You spend a lot of time, especially when it's essentially in a negative pressure isolation room for 2.5 months. There's a lot of time to focus on self and what matters and to be reflective. And I really had to learn patience, even patience between visits from nurses or therapists. It just was a really different way to test myself in an area that I wouldn't necessarily say, I was filled with patience beforehand. So I wouldn't want to do it again if I could avoid it. Obviously, I do believe there's something important to learn. And, the other silver lining for me of this whole hard situation was a reconnection with people that were a few circles removed. They're not like you. They're not like my wife. They're not like others that are near and dear or might know every major thing that's happened in my life. These are people, some of whom I had not for 40 or 50 years since young childhood communicated with. Maybe the people I lived next door in Philly or went to summer camp with, and they came out of the woodwork. Former folks that I worked with, that some of whom didn't even leave on good terms. But this allowed people to reconnect and to come out, and for me to feel kind of that incredible power that comes from a collective, all kind of rowing in the same direction with the common goal of seeing you recover. And it's a very, very powerful thing.
It's really at this time in our country's history, maybe in our world's history, as we feel divided about so many topics, it's a great way to end this segment of our conversation because it is, we feel so stratified based on political beliefs or religious beliefs or whatever with the George Floyd murder, on race issues. And it is a profound concept that people from all your walks of life who may think very differently about any number of topics and obviously come from different walks of life all kind of came together, and you could feel that power of that love. And whether it was the caregivers you described who took care of you when you weren't even conscious of what they were doing, sending you love and power of prayer and song and everything else, to all those people around you. It's really a wonderful story. It really is. I envision this interview to be completely different, but 8 months ago changed all that. And I can't tell you how much I appreciate your vulnerability to share this story. I know that you've been on the front page of the Dallas Morning News. You've gotten interviews with local and other news stations, and we're even invited at one point potentially to go to the Rose Garden. And so those are all stories for another day. But for you to share in a kind of intimate and vulnerable way, I know people are going to really take a lot out of this, and I know they're going to appreciate. So thank you for your friendship. You know how much I love you and your family and everybody around you, and I just appreciate your time.
Believe me, Craig, it's so mutual, and there's no firmer person that I'd rather do this for than you. And I'm so honored to be part of your process and to get to share some thoughts. And obviously, I just hope they're meaningful and impactful to the people that listen.
I feel certain they will be. Have a great rest of your day, and I'll talk to you soon.
Thank you. You too. Talk to you soon.
Bye.